only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division. And I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Today is Friday, June 26th, and we will hear the presentation, Economic Development and the Value of Place. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If your question is for a particular speaker, please state which speaker the question is for in the questions box. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thank you to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Economic Development Division. To learn more about all of APA's divisions, visit planning.org/divisions. And to learn about the chapters, planning.org/chapters. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit our new link, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcasts. And we actually are booked every Friday for the rest of the year. Not all of them have been scheduled for CM credit yet. They're not all posted yet, but they're all in process. So stay tuned. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just go to planning.org, go to your dashboard, select Activities by Provider. And today's provider, again, is the Economic Development Division, and then select today's title. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of our distance education credits, check our webcast webpage again at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will be available after the session. Just head to our webcast webpage again at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. I'd now like to introduce our two speakers today and get us underway. Our first speaker today is Michael Wilkerson. Mike is a senior economist at Echo Northwest and has been with the firm for 3 years. He has 8 years of previous experience in financial services. His areas of expertise include econometrics and applied microeconomics in the fields of real estate, banking, finance, transportation, and urban economics. He has applied expertise in projects involving housing market analysis, economic impact analysis, regional and microeconomic forecasting, benefit cost analysis, development feasibility studies, and litigation support and expert testimony. He received a PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate University and is currently an adjunct professor of economics at Portland State University. Our second speaker is Andy Struckoff. Andy is Associate Director at PGAV Planners and brings a variety of skills in economic and community development. Andy's professional career includes both public and private sector experience. Andy has led underwriting activities, analyzing potential acquisitions, tax increment financing planning activities, including composing redevelopment plans and cost-benefit analysis, business retention and recruitment projects, undertook return analysis activities, and also performed a variety of demographic analyses. Andy works with communities to develop solutions regarding open space, neighborhood, downtown planning, and public financing. His breadth of experience allows him to engage in projects as varied as land use policy, fiscal impact analyses, and market analyses. He also works with communities to develop effective policies and guidelines for using public incentives to attract private development. With that, I am going to turn the show over to Mike Wilkerson to get us started. Mike.
Thanks, Christine. Andy and I have done this once before, and we're happy to share this in a new format via webcast. So as an economist, generally, there are three things that we get asked regularly to do. The first of which is to break out our crystal ball and do some type of economic forecast. The second is to talk about or maybe even define sustainability. And the third is to talk about development and or economic development. And what we see is generally economic development and development are used interchangeably. And so what we want to do today is start off by defining economic development. So we're going to turn to the credible source on the matter, which is the International Economic Development Council. And their definition of economic development is a program, group of policies, or activity that seeks to improve the economic well-being and quality of life for a community by creating and or retaining jobs that facilitate growth and provide a stable tax base. So that's the common definition for which we want to start from. We want to look at, well, what is this cycle? And I think, as they mentioned, it's a group of policies. So economic development should not be thought of as a single policy. In fact, it's more of a dynamic cycle, which generally starts with some sort of business activity. That business activity generally is looking to increase the number of jobs. Through those jobs, we then see additional income being generated in our community. That income then generates the provision of additional wealth in that community. The wealth in the community often translates into a higher quality of life for that community, which then initiates the completion of the cycle, which is the quality of life oftentimes can attract additional business activity. So that's the general cycle, and the economic policies can be targeting any aspect of that cycle. What we'll see is that generally takes two primary forms for economic development. The first of which is we want to look to retain and grow our existing businesses. Oftentimes that's thought of as economic gardening. Economic gardening generally wants to focus on second stage companies. A second stage company has somewhere between 10 and 99 employees and something in the neighborhood of 1 million to 50 million in sales. A first stage company, by comparison, is less than 10 companies, and these generally, 10 employees, they generally represent the largest number of employees in any given economy, and certainly even nationally. The issue with the first stage companies is that they're not necessarily providing the highest potential for growth within an individual company. So if we're looking to grow companies rather than create startups or companies, it's really these second stage companies, which are generally more growth oriented. They also tend to be more of the traded sector versus the local sector. So the traded sector is looking to bring additional dollars into the economy rather than something more of the local sector where we're just creating less dynamic multipliers. So that's the first approach. The second approach is we look to attract new businesses into our communities. What we want to understand here is that not all jobs are created equal. We want to target specific industries and sectors where we have a strong multiplier. And a multiplier essentially indicates that for every job, how many additional jobs are created. For every dollar of income, how many additional jobs or income are associated with that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is wages matter. Not a job is not a job. So we want to look at jobs that ideally pay high wages, which oftentimes are also having strong multiplier effects. Similarly, we want to look at jobs that create additional job growth so that they're synergistic in our economy and getting additional jobs created, not just bringing in one job, and that's the sum total of the impact. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Andy to talk a little bit about taxes and how that can impact economic growth.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. This is Andy Struckoff. I'm going to talk here for a little bit about, Mike just mentioned that economic development is really a set of policies rather than one singular policy. And when people are talking about policy associated with economic development, oftentimes they're talking about tax policy and how tax rates affect economic growth. So I thought I'd just spend a couple of slides talking about that. Recently, the Congressional Research Service did a study that reviewed the relationship between tax rates and economic growth. And the study suggested that both labor supply and savings and investment are insensitive to tax rates, which means that essentially that they move independently of movements in tax rates. It's also important to consider that certain business expenses associated with business development are already tax favored, meaning they're tax deductible. So lower taxes should affect investments in research and development, education, and infrastructure. And small business taxes are also sometimes emphasized as important to growth, but the study suggested that there's a modest and uncertain effect on entrepreneurship with respect to tax rates. On this slide here, we see two tables. The first table shows over a long period of time how movements in tax rates on labor and capital gains correlate with growth in real GDP. And you see from 1950 to 2010, the tax rates for capital gains and income decreased, as did the rate of growth in real GDP, which is sort of a negative correlation that doesn't really agree with a lot of policy statements that lower taxes equals higher rates of economic growth. The second table represents similar information over a shorter time frame, 1987 to 2007. You see the average marginal income tax rate grew from 33.3% to 35%, and over that same time frame, the rate of growth in real GDP also increased, showing a positive correlation between tax increases and growth in real GDP. So thank you. I just want to spend a couple slides on that, and I'll come back in a few minutes. And right now, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Wilkerson.
Thanks, Andy. So picking up on the two main economic development approaches, we want to look at, well, what do businesses desire? They desire kind of four main buckets and categories. One, which is land and built space. The second is local infrastructure and local services. The third is labor and entrepreneurship. And the final is access to suppliers and consumers. So understanding what it is that business desire, what we want to look at, the lens is, well, how can government help support these activities? So in the developable land and built space, governments can aid through things like easy entitlement processes, favorable zoning, brownfield redevelopment, land assembly, land cost write-downs, building improvements. On the local infrastructure and local services side, we can do things like have competitive building utility environments, reliable off-site networks, and offer reasonable systems development charges. On the educated and skilled workforce side of things, certainly offering quality public education, workforce training, placemaking. Certainly placemaking falls squarely into this category, but it certainly also has influence in the other desired business attributes and things like value within the labor force and diversity in the workforce. And finally, in terms of access to suppliers and consumers, can help by offering regional branding, marketing. We can encourage clustering, which efficient supply chains, and help with assembling land parcels. So that's kind of how can government support the process for web business. Broadly, when we're thinking about an economic development framework, traditionally it's been thought of as a relationship between jobs and people. And certainly the thought was that people will follow jobs. What we're seeing more recently now is that jobs are certainly, in looking for high-skilled labor, oftentimes will locate in areas where they find those sources of labor or even access to capital. So jobs possibly could be following people, was the more recent trend. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift in that dynamic to where both could possibly be following housing. And that's really through the affordability lens, to where, you know, there's exiles from, say, the Bay Area for companies or people who are looking for affordability, and they'll move to places like, say, Portland or St. Louis because they perceive that the housing affordability is much improved, and they might offer amenities, natural and both local amenities, to help incentivize those types of people. So what we're going to do now is focus in on two case studies, Portland, and then Andy will take over with St. Louis. And I think the perception is that these are on opposite ends of the placemaking success spectrum. So I will talk a little bit about Portland. What we've seen is, in this most recent New York Times Magazine headline is, will Portland always be a community for the young? A retirement community for the young, I should say. And the thought is, people move here and work is optional. So the thought is, getting back to the previous slide, of people select the place first, and then they worry about trying to find a job second. So that is our overarching framework for looking at Portland. And recently in 2014, a local firm in Portland, DHM, conducted a survey. And what they asked was, which one of the following statements comes closer to your point of view? Statement A, a focus on making this area a great place to live, with things like parks, restaurants, public transit, land use, and it will attract people and businesses to stay and move here. Or response B, focus on creating jobs and attracting business. We need jobs to create a great place to live. So those are the two responses. And at APA, we asked for a show of hands to see which response was more likely. It would be great if we had technology available to do this in real time. However, I don't know of such technology. However, I'm guessing the results would probably closely mirror what we saw at APA, which was, I believe every single person in the room raised their hand for response A, and nobody raised their hand for response B. So given the audience at APA, I think is a little bit different than what we saw when we interviewed Portland. And I think the thought was, in Portland, placemaking would be very high on the list of things. However, the survey data didn't follow that. What we saw was actually 49% of people said that they preferred to create jobs relative to 46%. So closely a 50-50 split. A second follow-up question was asked on the survey, which was, which economic development strategy comes closer to your point of view? Response A, this area can have a strong economy based on small, locally owned businesses. Our economic development priority should focus on developing small, locally owned businesses in the area. Or response B, this area cannot have a strong economy based on small, locally owned businesses. Our economic development priority should focus on attracting, retaining, and expanding larger businesses that create large number of family wage jobs. When we asked this at APA, we got much more of a split response on the question in terms of answer A versus answer B. In Portland, what we saw was the focus was heavily on small businesses, 62% versus 31% for big business. So understanding that in Portland, the preference was for placemaking was roughly equal to the idea of we want to create jobs. And when we're looking to create jobs, really the thought was small businesses is what we wanted to look at. So what I want to do here is turn back the clock a little bit and look at a headline. This is not from The Onion, which the headline says, "Fighting Sprawl, Oregon County Makes Deal with Intel to Limit Job Growth." This is a legitimate article published in the New York Times in 1999. They said, please don't create too many new jobs. The thought here was, we want you to invest in new infrastructure, but we don't want you to add any jobs. And I think certainly that isn't the current landscape of where we're at, and certainly here in Oregon and Washington County or in many communities across the country. But as little as 15 years ago, the thought was, please don't add too many jobs. What this has kind of led to is what we are calling the Portland paradox. The Portland paradox is, looking at this chart, you can see, if we go back to early 2000s, the GDP per capita in Portland was less than the U.S. metro average, about 90%. Since that time, it's been massively accelerating to where now we're about 135% of the GDP per capita in Portland. Specifically, Oregon is also, I think, the second or third largest state nationally in terms of GDP per capita. So I guess the question you're asking is, how is this a paradox? What's the issue there? That should be a great story for economic development. The problem is, when we turn to specifically jobs and or income, what you'll see is that starting in the same time frame, the income per capita in Portland was roughly the same as the U.S. metro average and has been steadily declining since that time. So how is it that we can have increased economic growth and at the same time falling personal incomes? And that is the paradox. And what I'm going to argue is that this is the unintended consequence of successful placemaking. So why is it that we can do that? So a couple of places we can look. So the disconnect. This notion of the second paycheck. We want to look at natural amenities as a first place to look, and the notion that people are willing to pay something for natural amenities was studied by David Albuy recently in looking at a cross-sectional study across the U.S. What he was trying to say is, what % of your income are you willing to give up for a certain natural amenity? So if we can eliminate excessive heat, so if you're living in Phoenix and you could move to somewhere where it's not oppressively hot, you'd be willing to give up 4% of your income. Similarly, if we can eliminate excessive cold, we can move from North Dakota to somewhere more moderate, we'd be willing to give up 3.9%. Certainly here in the Northwest, we lack sun, so if we are willing to get 10% more days of sunshine, we'd be willing to give up 2.9% of our income. If we have some variation, some pretty mountains to look at, we can increase the slope in our community by 10%, we'd be willing to give up 2.7%. And if we're proximate to the coast, 1.7%. So in total, if we added up all of these pieces, we could be looking at somewhere between 15 and 20% of our income we'd be willing to accept to move to a more desirable community in terms of natural amenities. The second piece is, in addition to the natural amenities, we have local amenities. And local amenities is where we start to see placemaking entering the equation. On the local amenities side of things, what we can do is look at measuring the value of these local amenities through real estate prices. So what we're essentially able to do is we can say we can capitalize the value of these amenities, which is a great approach. The problem with that approach is it's very difficult to study nationally. So we don't have good studies across the country where we can say uniformly this amenity is valuable like we did in the Albuy study. Primarily the data is difficult to collect. However, what we've seen in lots of markets we've studied, we looked in Portland, Seattle, Boise, Las Vegas, numerous markets in Texas, and we see consistently that these local values are positively correlated to value and that they're capitalized. So things like access to public transit, walkability, retail density, quality education, and proximity to the central business districts are all things that we consistently see across markets as adding value, which are all elements that can be contributing in terms of positive placemaking and their impact on economic development. Turning to Portland specifically, and certainly proximity to parks. Turning to Portland, what we've seen here is a map that shows the home affordability for single-family homes. And for those of you that aren't that familiar with Portland, right here in this black circle is kind of our downtown core. What you'll see is, and I think this is different than certainly many cities, is the areas close in and proximate to downtown are more affordable. So if we look over here, we kind of have this demarcation of about $70,000. $70,000 in Portland is the median family income. So if a home is affordable to someone earning $70,000 or less, that's these green shaded areas. So out in the outskirts in Portland and Gresham and Hillsborough, there are pockets of affordability for those earning less than $70,000. However, in the core, what we see is prices are significantly higher, and the incomes required to live there are significantly higher, such that all these red areas with $100,000 or more required are in the core of the city. You know, what that means is, in Portland specifically, $100,000 would be the 72nd percentile. So Portland has basically priced out all but the top 25% or so from living in the urban core. And the reason that we see this prices, like we just recently talked about, is the capitalization of these local amenities. We have access to public transit. We've done a good job of creating retail density in mixed-use neighborhoods. We have walkability proximate to the central business district. Parks along our waterfront. So the kind of unintended consequence of the success in placemaking is that, similar to what we saw in the Portland paradox, is incomes have now stagnated. However, the demand to live in these areas proximate to these local amenities has caused prices to go up. And what I want to do is come back to the survey that we looked at earlier, where we said, okay, what was placemaking? And the mean response was 46%. What we want to see is that this actually varies drastically by demographic. So 46% as our mean response. However, if we look at those aged 18 to 34, 61% of them actually said they preferred placemaking. Similarly, residents who had recently moved to Portland within the last 5 years, 58%. And we can see for residents who have been there for more than 10 years, they're right at the mean response of 46%. If we're aged 55 or older, only 40% prefer placemaking. If we have a high school education or less, 33%. And then certainly in Portland, I think the perception is that we are not a Republican-heavy environment, but for those who choose to affiliate with that party, only 23% preferred placemaking rather to job creation. So what we see is quite the bifurcation, where those with less education or nearing retirement preferred job making rather than placemaking, and those recent residents who have moved to Portland or the Gen Xers are the ones who are really looking at placemaking. So as a consequence of that, what we've seen is we've done a good job of creating this environment where people seeking placemaking have moved to Portland, and the result of that has been essentially an oversupply of labor, and the result of that has been income has stagnated. So this creative class is the other way that we can look at, well, who are these Gen Xers and what they desire? They're highly educated, and what they seek is business models that encourage creativity. So they are willing to work in different new startup environments that aren't the traditional business models, and these are kind of the types of workers that businesses generally try to attract, and we have an abundance of them in Portland. The second is they'll select location over jobs, and this is the unintended consequence of the placemaking, is we've done a great job of creating the place, and these creative class Gen Xers want to locate here, but because of that, the labor market has basically been bid down to where there's lots of quality trained people who are living in Portland first, looking for jobs second. And kind of an unrelated but important consequence of these types of workers is that the non-traditional office space or non-traditional work hours have become much more prevalent in Portland. So that the central business district itself hasn't been the recipient of lots of these jobs. It's these kind of new adaptive reuse areas that are kind of nearby the central business district. So from a placemaking standpoint, those are things we want to keenly understand. So that's the piece on Portland. What I'm going to do now is turn it back over to Andy to talk about St. Louis.
Let's see. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Mike. Sorry for the pause, everyone. You should now be able to see start of my St. Louis portion of the presentation. See there a picture of the Gateway Arch and a picture of St. Louis, King Louis IX of France. So I'll talk a little bit about St. Louis, which I think might be on the opposite end of the spectrum with respect to placemaking success and economic growth. In St. Louis, our average annual growth in population is roughly 0.1%. We're not growing at a fantastic rate in terms of population, and our economic conditions, while they're improving over the last recession, are still lagging behind, some of our peers, especially, since we're talking about Portland, I selected some cities from the Northwest and West Coast, Portland, the Portland metro area, the San Francisco metro area, and the Seattle metro area are all certainly doing a little bit better than the St. Louis region has been since the recession in terms of economic growth. And the reason for that really, I think, has a lot to do with the perceptions about St. Louis. Our region is regularly ranked #1 or #2 in terms of violent crime. All the second paycheck characteristics Mike talked about earlier, if you can eliminate excessive heat and cold, well, we have excessive heat and we have excessive cold. We don't have any mountains, and we're down on the coast. We're an old industrial river town. And we have the reputation, frankly, as a place that people leave. A lot of St. Louisans that I know personally have moved to Portland over the years, and they've moved to Seattle as well. A recent Atlanta Journal-Constitution article from April talked about St. Louis and the city of Chicago and compared the two in terms of planning successes, highlighting places where the authors thought St. Louis made some missteps and where Chicago made other choices and had success where St. Louis didn't. Personally, I think the article was fair, but it was an interesting planning conversation. Also just sort of highlights some of the negative perceptions about St. Louis's history. And these are issues that economic development professionals in the St. Louis region have to address when working on economic development, specifically with respect to attracting young entrepreneurs and established businesses. Just for an example, within the past year, a Swiss agribusiness company was looking for a place to put a North American headquarters, sort of selecting cities. So their site selection team hadn't even put St. Louis on their list. But a member of the corporate team was a veteran of Monsanto. Monsanto is a large agribusiness corporation whose world headquarters is in St. Louis. And he asked them why they didn't have St. Louis on that list. And many of the reasons cited were reasons that are on this list. But he had St. Louis put on the list, and he brought everyone here to take a look and look around town. And once the company got past the negative perceptions and got to know the region better, they ultimately decided to pick St. Louis, which is positive. But these negative perceptions keep St. Louis from being considered for a lot of those types of business attractions. And of course, last year we had Ferguson. Last August, a young man by the name of Michael Brown was shot dead by a Ferguson police officer. This picture came from one of the protests that happened after that event. I chose it just because it's a very nice, dramatic picture, and I think it captures the sentiment of the people in St. Louis County around that time pretty well. What Ferguson ultimately represented, all the protests, are really about a lot of underlying socioeconomic issues that have just been kind of simmering under the surface that just burst wide open after Michael Brown was shot dead. And part of it is in the St. Louis region, we have a lot of fractured governance. We have 90 municipalities. So here you see a map of St. Louis County and the city of St. Louis, and you see a lot of small municipalities all scattered throughout St. Louis County. These are 90 different municipalities, all with their own city governments, all with their own tax rates, all with their own service provisions, individual police departments, fire departments, and that sort of thing. And a lot of them get a third or more of their revenue from police citations, traffic violation citations, and other things, which is perceived, and actually be in the Washington Post wrote an article about this recently, went really in depth about how this really turns into being a tax on poor people. Folks that can't afford to pay traffic violations end up getting higher fees and having to pay, having to spend time in jail because they can't pay, which is a serious problem. And not only is that a problem socioeconomically, but it's also a problem from a business standpoint, because you have all these different players in the region, so to speak. They're sometimes difficult to get together. So in St. Louis, we have a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. The immediate impacts of the Ferguson situation was that the pipeline for business attraction projects in particular just kind of stopped for a couple months. St. Louis wasn't really a place that was talked about for a while. One of the responses has been the establishment of a group called the Ferguson Commission, whose job is to meet and hold public meetings and really engage citizens about the socioeconomic issues underlying the events in Ferguson, the protests afterward, and to come up with solutions. We've been spending a lot of time talking with people, engaging both citizens and police forces to try to get people to come together to an understanding, and also talking to the business community. There's also an organization called Better Together St. Louis who's exploring regional governance issues and regional economic development issues, specifically looking to address the governance and taxation situation, hoping to improve that. But these are big challenges that won't be solved quickly or easily. It may take a generation or more to fix them entirely, and what will determine St. Louis' future really is the kind of place it becomes, with respect to the governance situation, and also with respect to just other public amenities. The St. Louis region does have some assets. And we were recently ranked as the #1 city for entrepreneurs by Puppet and Mechanics magazine. One reason for that is really the St. Louis region overall has a low cost and high standard of living. There's an organization in town called Launch Code that was founded by some young tech entrepreneurs that provides free education and places people in apprenticeships in computer programming throughout the region. And they may spread this concept nationally. And also the region has a lot of transportation logistics assets. Railroad and river transit is a big economic engine in the St. Louis region. This is Mike's slide. I'm going to kick it back to him for a moment.
Sure. So in kind of wrapping up here, we want to kind of summarize some things, and then we're happy to field questions. So kind of some of the implications that fall through from the kind of comparison of Portland to St. Louis are, what should be our economic development strategy? Are we going to focus squarely on placemaking, or is job growth our primary objective? In looking at different approaches to economic development, do we want to focus on small businesses or on large businesses? And then the last kind of category of policy questions are, we need to understand what our natural amenities are in our community and how that might impact the desirability and also the types of wages that are offered. And also from our local amenity standpoint, what does that do for value and affordability? And in sum of all of those things, we want to look at understanding through those 4 different buckets, what is our comparative advantage in our market, and how can we leverage the assets that we have most effectively. So those are kind of our policy questions, and we're happy to turn it back over to Christine now if there are any questions.
Thank you. Okay, let's see what we have here. Okay, the first question, how can economic development programs focusing on downtown in a mid-sized minority majority city promote improved amenities and placemaking without forcing out small existing businesses and gentrifying closed-in neighborhoods? That's for either one of you.
Okay. Well, I guess to start on that, I guess it depends on what type of revitalization you're talking about and who's doing it and who's paying for it. And I think that certainly public improvements can be done without impacting local businesses or forcing them out, unless you're using some sort of financing mechanism where you're raising taxes or imposing some other cost burden on those businesses. But if you can figure out a way to do your revitalization, to enhance the place value of the downtown, without imposing a cost on those local businesses that are already there, then I think you can succeed in that. I don't know if you have anything to add, Mike. Or?
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, this is an area that specifically in Portland and lots of communities we're dealing with now is certainly we want to look at revitalizing our downtown cores or even certain neighborhoods, but we don't want to have displacement occurring. And how do you do that? And there's no easy answer to that. I think the trade-off is always, okay, you have to understand that there are long-run consequences of what you're going to do, and only so many things you can do in the short run to help mitigate that. So in terms of gentrification, really, it's a long-term focus that needs to be had, and coordination amongst numerous agencies. So things like providing regulated, subsidized housing in that area. Cities who understand that if they're going into a currently underutilized area, policy tools like land banking and the like can help kind of ease that transition. But certainly, that's always the challenge is, how, you want to revitalize the community, but you want to understand that you don't want to change the fabric of it, and there's no easy answer to that.
Okay, great. Next question. How do you find a balance between placemaking and not stagnating wages? I'm not sure I understand that question, but maybe you do.
Yeah, so I think that's looking at somewhat of the Portland paradox, which is to say, you've been really successful at attracting the types of people who are these creative class, high value add workers, but at the same time, if you've done a really good job of doing that, the unintended consequence is this notion of, okay, well, wages are now stagnating. So yeah, in Portland specifically, this is basically the primary focus now is, stated economic development strategy for Portland was placemaking only. And the problem with that approach is stagnating wages in and of themselves aren't a problem. It's stagnating wages in conjunction with increasing costs for housing primarily. So it's understanding that if you are going to focus on placemaking, that you should also be looking at things like, is constraining our land supply impacting the prices? Or do our zoning regulations allow for creating density in other areas to kind of help relieve that burden? Or certainly on the affordable housing front, can you get in front of that wave by providing enough market housing that becomes basically the affordable housing through filtering processes down the road? So that's part of it. Also specific to Oregon, but not specific to placemaking. Part of the problem is that a lot of these successful kind of second stage startup companies have a lot of success in Portland, but then as they get funded because of the tax structure in Portland, they oftentimes leave. So what you get is these companies that are having exit events and creations of wealth and high income oftentimes will leave to Washington or California for a variety of reasons, and you kind of lose that long-term benefit of the increased wages that go along with that. So that's the currently seemingly the #1 topic in Portland is how do you kind of address this paradox?
Okay, great. Next question. What do you think are some of the elements that local governments could focus on related to what businesses are looking for? Not the typical placemaking, but related to the access to suppliers, consumer side, attracting strong multiplier jobs. For example, citywide broadband. This is for either one of you.
Andy, do you want to take a cut at that, or you want me to?
You want to take a stab at it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so as far as policies that help attract the correct types of jobs, it's getting back to what we talked about earlier, and certainly, using broadband as an example. We do some work for rural economies that are looking to attract data centers as an example. So, using access to broadband as kind of a minimum requirement for attracting those types of businesses is something that you can understand. But again, it gets back to understanding what your comparative advantage is in your given market. And if your comparative advantage is to say ideal climate for those types of IT businesses, data centers as an example, if your wages structures are really relatively low, if you have reliable low-cost utilities, then putting in a policy like a high-quality dark fiber network to help attract those types of businesses is something you can do. And that's just an example of understanding the type of industry cluster that you want to attract based on your comparative advantages. So, it's really going to depend upon the region. But I think the goal is if you understand the types of businesses and the type of positive externalities that they can create through supply chain relationships locally, and you can be strategic about that, then you can have certain policies locally that will help attract those businesses.
Andy, did you have any comments on that one?
No, nothing much else to add. It's right on the money. Looking at competitive advantages, especially with respect to data centers, looking at nearby electric supply and water supply for cooling.
Okay, great. Next question. How can placemaking be achieved when job growth is the priority, for instance, within a growing suburban community?
What was that, Christine?
Sure. And also, a couple of people are asking if both of you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit more loudly.
Okay.
So how can placemaking be achieved when job growth is the priority? For instance, within a growing suburban community.
Andy, do you want to talk about that maybe through the lens of some type of TIF or other type of public instruments that can be used to kind of capture that?
Sure. If you're talking about a suburban growing community, it's looking at job attraction specifically. There are certain things you can do and incentives you can use to capture revenue from that growth. Capture tax revenue from the growth in real estate investment that the city can use to pay for new public parks or other public improvements that really help with the place value. You see a lot of those mechanisms used to create trail networks. You see them used to create parks and central squares, town center type developments. And also looking at your zoning regulations and looking at what you can plan for and build around your growing community or within it. So as you grow, you leave space open for parks and trails and other things that current and future residents might find appealing from a quality of life perspective.
Okay. Mike, do you have any comments on that?
No, I think that's right on the mark.
Okay. Okay, can either one of you provide some examples of government incentives for second stage businesses, especially in downtowns?
Mike, you want to talk about that, or you want me to?
Yes, I mean, as far as, looking at second stage businesses, it's not so much, I would say, incentives. I think oftentimes, in economic development, it's always incentive first. I think it's more so providing the infrastructure and the requirements that they need to be successful, rather than, say, a subsidy or an incentive to help them come in. If you provide them with, the type of access to, let's say, public transit and other things that can get them access to the types of employees that they need to grow their business in an efficient way, that's helpful. Certainly there are subsidies available in terms of, depending on the type of business, in terms of either if you're constructing a new facility, waiving the systems development charges to attract the types of businesses that you want to make it more affordable to start up, or in terms of income tax subsidies and those types of things. So, there are a host, but, locally, I think if the question is locally rather than, say, state or federally, it's, providing the type of infrastructure, the adequate zoning, access to space, all the things that we talked about that are going to be key for providing the environment for those second stage companies to thrive.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's really important to have the local infrastructure set up to encourage those businesses and help them grow. From the state level, you can see some incentives that are associated with job growth. Tax credits associated with the number of jobs created. At the local level, or at the state level, frankly, you see some tax credits for angel investors, venture capitalists, to incentivize them seeding new startup companies, and that's something in the state of Missouri we've seen a lot of in the past few years, with some really good success so far.
Yeah,
Okay.
Another thing in Portland,
which
isn't necessarily an incentive, but helping provide infrastructure, is in terms of a lot of these companies, they're not necessarily in the incubator stage or accelerator stage, but in Portland, they have a couple of kind of peer mentor groups for these entrepreneurs who are kind of in that second stage, and they create facilities where they can come in and have an office space for the mentors, where they can help other companies in similar places in the development spectrum, accelerate that growth. So that's an approach that's been taken here locally in Portland.
Okay. Next question. What is a good method of visioning, analyzing a community's comparative advantage? Who should be the players? Do you find that local leadership and politicians are honest with themselves about it?
So my quick response to that is generally no. Oftentimes, the thought is, I want to attract X type of business because this is the fad, or because this is who we think we want to be, rather than who we are. So I would say, oftentimes the politicians aren't the place you want to try to go to help lead that effort. Again, it's understanding your kind of, your public infrastructure and what that allows. Understanding demographics in your community. Do you have a lot of highly trained, educated workforce, or are you lacking in those areas? And what are the types of industries that you can attract that will leverage, what you have, rather than, spending time offering a lot of incentives to bring in a few jobs, which won't then have a high multiplier in your area because the supply chains aren't there, and the spin-offs aren't likely to happen. So, yeah, it's a difficult question, but I would say, certainly politicians aren't the first place to look for that.
Yeah, and I think I probably agree with that. Especially the regional leadership and their job is really to be a cheerleader for the region and really try to recruit as much as they can, maybe not always in the most directed way, but to the extent that those efforts can be directed toward businesses that complement, or businesses or industries that complement your region's comparative advantages, and you have the most chance to really get good multiplier jobs attracted to your community and to grow new businesses.
Okay. So this is for both of you. Do you recommend a greater emphasis on placemaking or on job creation, or a mix depending on local conditions for successful economic development, particularly in terms of a mid-sized city downtown? And if you guys could both speak up more, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that the last point is the crucial one. Is it depends on who you are. Certainly in Portland, the focus has been on placemaking, and that's been successful. And now the shift needs to be towards job creation. If you're on the other end of the spectrum where you have good jobs, you just don't have the types of jobs that you necessarily want, and you want to attract a different class of workers, then the shift on placemaking should take hold. So it's entirely dependent on the type of community that you are and the type of community that you want to become.
Yeah, and in St. Louis, I'd say the focus has been on job creation. It's been on attracting large employers and compelling existing employers to expand and remain within the region, which is a focus that's had mixed results for the region, and I think the leadership of the region is starting to realize that the lack of focus on placemaking, on keeping the region a really great place to live, or greater than it is now, has I think cost the region some jobs and some opportunities to attract jobs. So right now we're seeking to strike that balance between placemaking and job creation.
Okay, next question. Are there any studies on food business clusters as an economic development strategy that either one of you are aware of?
I'm not aware of any studies on food business clusters. I am aware of some incubators in the St. Louis area that focus on that type of business, specifically associated with baking and that sort of thing, that has produced some positive results in the St. Louis area. But I don't know of any studies nationwide on that specific topic. I don't know if you do, Mike.
No, I don't. But specifically in Portland, there's been a lot of success in the food cluster business, and we've actually been in discussions with trying to look at that as a success story locally. So maybe check back in a year from now, and we may have something interesting to say about that in Portland. But in our cursory research for prepping for that project, we haven't seen a lot of work done either in the local market or nationally specific to that type of cluster.
Okay, how about medical schools downtown as placemaking or job creation as multiplier? Any experience with that or any comments on that?
Sure. So specifically, the medical school is a tough one because it depends on what type of medical school you are. You can be actually a very local sector-based medical school, or you can be a very traded sector, depending on your locale. So in Portland, we have a large medical school, Oregon Health Sciences University, that's just proximate to downtown, and is also a huge research institution, and is a heavily traded sector, given that they draw their students from all over and also attract research dollars from all over, and the multipliers associated with that school are very large, and they're a key driver to our economy here in Portland. So yeah, I mean, it depends on the type of medical school that you are, if you're research-based or not, and where you draw your funding and your students from as to the impact of multipliers per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that observation, definitely.
Okay, and our last question, what would be your recommendations for supporting adequate affordable housing?
Andy, you want to take a stab at that, or I'm
Sure.
happy to.
Sure. Supporting adequate affordable housing. That's a tough one because, affordable housing, affordable for working folks, especially in this day and age where, the growth in housing prices over the past decade, 15 years, has really outstripped the growth in wages over the same time period. So you have, folks earning wages below the area median income who need some assistance to get into a home that they can own themselves, and you also have, people who have the median income who can't afford as much as the median income could buy 15 years ago. So you need to look at, I think, mixed housing products for younger working families if you want to get them into home ownership. So I think you look at, how you plan residential development, how you zone it, and how you get it to be built. So you have an adequate mix of sizes of housing, right? So you have, starter homes and you have family homes in the same neighborhood, and you have, smaller lots and larger lots in the same neighborhood. So you have sort of a wide spectrum of things that folks at different income levels can afford. I don't know, Mike, that's just kind of off the top of my head right there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so affordable housing is one of the most difficult things to define because people interpret it, in two different ways. You're talking about your kind of 60% and below of a median family income, your kind of regulated, subsidized affordable units, and then you're, talking affordable in a non-regulated sense for the above 60% in your, 80 to 120% in your so-called workforce housing. And, what do you mean by affordable? And I think the basic thought is that, you need to understand that if you're looking to help support the regulated, subsidized end of that spectrum, that no public entity has the type of funds required to do that. So it needs to be a two-pronged approach where in the short run, you're looking to do that in an efficient way by not necessarily, the trade-off always also in affordable housing is, if you're looking at it in terms of geographic distribution, you want to have a mix within neighborhoods, but oftentimes the cost to provide affordable housing, subsidized housing, regulated housing in very expensive neighborhoods just is at a high multiple relative to other areas. So that's the trade-off that you have to be willing to consider. The second is that really the only way you can actually address affordability across the spectrum is through the long run, and primarily that lens is through, like Andy was saying, building market rate housing in a smart way now, so that as the process of filtering happens over a 20 to 30 year process, you have housing products across the spectrum available across all these vast and different areas. So the key is understanding what type of policy levers you have in the short run and how you can help aid the regulated subsidized portion of the affordable housing spectrum. But then also it's really a long run play, and understanding that if you have a problem of housing affordability now, it's basically too late. The time to start worrying about affordable housing is before it becomes a problem, and oftentimes there isn't the public policy support to do that, and it's only when, for example, in Portland, we're starting to see this now, all of a sudden this is becoming an issue. Meanwhile, all of the neighborhoods have already gentrified and changed. There are no more pockets of close-in affordable land that you can purchase. We don't have inclusionary zoning practices here, so there's lots of things that could have been done over the past 20 years that would help that problem. So again, there is no easy answer, but understanding coordination amongst local, state, federal agencies, and certainly putting in policies that are short run but also long run in nature, and help to kind of work towards where you want to be.
Great. Well, I think that'll do it for us today. So, Andy and Mike, thank you for joining us. And on the screen is their contact information. So if anyone has any further questions, feel free to contact them. This video, again, this session is being recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast, or it's youtube.com/Planning Webcast. And a PDF has just been posted, and that will be up on our regular webpage, which is ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So thanks to the both of you, and we will talk to everyone next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Everyone have a great weekend. Bye-bye.